DC Superhero Girls Teen Power is a reasonably long name, but that doesn't matter. The game was announced at the Nintendo Direct presentation where it got a pretty negative reaction at the time, which I was surprised about because I thought the game actually looked quite cute and had a nice and interesting art style. But as most things on the internet, controversy often comes from undeserved places, as in this case, it seems to come from people lashing out because they expected more from that specific Nintendo show, and the just overall lack of understanding of the idea that the people complaining might not be the target audience for this game, given it's a game based on a show about superhero girls who go to high school and have to deal with the drama that comes with that in a very PG and accessible way, given, well, it is a show for kids. And of course, just the simple fact it's about superheroes and girls does bring out the worst in what I hope is a vocal minority of gamers trademarked. Now, these people were never gonna play this game, so that's not why I bring this up. The reason I bring this up is because you might have found this video after having already watched or read some really overtly negative perspective on this game from someone who probably didn't even try it, and that's a bit unfair, I think we can agree. As we don't know if this might actually be a fairly decent game, especially for its target audience. And if I can give you a clue on how this review is gonna pan out, I think I enjoyed this game more than the Avengers, which isn't saying much, but let's move on. Going back to the TV show, I'll be honest, I only watched a couple of episodes very randomly out of pure curiosity, and honestly, it's not for me. I said before the show is about superhero girls who are going through high school, but it's done through a perspective of a kids show who, of course, have not been through high school yet and does feel childish in that way, which did make it somewhat hard for me to care or have any motivation to keep watching. But to be fair, again, only watched a couple random episodes and it did seem like there was a level of continuity, especially around characters and their relationships. So, while not for me, I definitely give it the benefit of a doubt, and I think it would be a pretty good show overall for any kid under 10 years old, you know, the target demographic. But regardless, this leads us to talk about the story of this game, which very much follows in the same footsteps, with very friendly and happy characters, a world where superheroes and villains all go to the same school and they're kinda generally friendly with each other when they're not in costume. And going with that kid friendly vibe, it's a world where the villain are also just barely villains because they know inevitably some kids will prefer them, especially with a show with such a positive light on them. And so they make them more like anti heroes instead, which is fine, but does leave the real villains of the story to be somewhat weak and lame, honestly. There are two main antagonists in this game, and one of them is revealed pretty early on to be Toyman, which is a villain I'm not familiar with, but here his design is very silly looking in a seemingly unaware way. And he's not intimidating at all, to say the least. He mostly serves to justify the hordes of enemies in the game, which are for the most part evil toys, and also to hide the sort of real antagonist of the game, which I won't spoil since it is a twist, even if a very obvious one. Overall, though, it's fine. If you like the characters in the show, I think you'll enjoy them here. It is fairly faithful from my understanding of it. But if you're not a fan, then you're not gonna get much out of it. And once again, it's clear that it's meant for a younger audience, which I've said multiple times at this point. Now let's talk about the more interesting bit, that is the actual gameplay. DC Superhero Girls is an action game with some open world and collectathon elements, where you play as the DC Superhero Girls and villains. By the end of the game, you'll have 6 characters you can alternate between freely during the open world sections and also choose between them to go into any mission, but some missions do only allow certain characters for story reasons. There is quite a bit to unpack here, so let's start with the characters. I'll try to be vague as not to spoil too much, as like I said before, some of the characters, especially the villain ones, only unlock fairly late in the game. But regardless, there are 6 of them, and they work surprisingly different from each other. Like, for example, Power Girl can fly and has a freezing breath and laser eyes for abilities, while Wonder Woman, for example, has an ability with her whip and another one with her shield. These are actually pretty unique abilities from each other, but their basic combos, even as they use different weapons, feel very similar. Doing basic attacks in a combo with a finishing attack that does more damage and knockback to the opponent. These combos can also be mixed with special abilities to create special attacks that usually are more useful in the way that they work than in how much damage they deal. Like, for example, Power Girl's Freezing Breath, when used normally, will make her do a short range spin attack that freezes and damages enemies, while doing this ability in conjunction with the combo will make her do a Freezing Breath that locks on to a singular character, doing more damage than it would do with the regular ability, even if it is less overall damage because you don't hit as many characters. And also, it has more range, which is another advantage. So you can see how these two attacks can be useful even though they're pretty different. Now, the thing with varying special abilities and movement mechanics is that while they add variety, it's also clear that some characters are just better than others, and in a way it makes sense. Of course, Power Girl, who is basically a female Superman, is more powerful than Batgirl, who has no powers. But in practice, I just had very little reason to play as Batgirl, especially in the movement sense, as having the ability to fly will literally make some missions absolute cakewalks, given a lot of them have some level of platforming. But not everything is roses, even with the better characters. Combat can feel very floaty, and the timing for pulling off perfect dodges, which allow you to do powerful counterattacks, the timing on these can feel a bit off to me. That might be a me thing, but regardless, when it comes to enemy variety, then there is actually a surprising amount, with different enemies like creepy dolls, teddy bears, and robots with various variations within each type of enemy, like for example a big teddy bear that hits harder or a smaller bear that moves faster. That kind of gaming logic variations that you might be used to. And of course, once again, almost all of them are based on kids' toys because, well, the main villain is Toyman. Even with a nice enemy variety though, mission structures do lead to repetition, as most levels will either be beat X number of enemies or defend a building for X amount of time, with the little variation outside of that. In the combat situations, most variation I saw was just something like disarming bombs in a certain amount of time or escorting a character while having to protect them from enemies. This not being helped with also the lack of locations you fight in, as it can be very repetitive. You will see the same mission locations a lot. The bosses though do somewhat make up for these, as they do add a lot of variety and also challenge to an extent. They all have very different patterns and tactics, which is good, but with that said, the game is also never particularly hard at all unless you really let yourself get underleveled, which I guess leads me to talk about that, as when you finish missions you receive rewards, which are primarily money and points to level up, but also things like clothes and buildings to buy, but more on that in a bit. For now, let's stick to the level up system to try and finish up this combat section of the gameplay. Well, while playing the game, you and your other characters, who may also join in any mission, even if you don't control them directly, will level up, but honestly, if you asked me, I have no idea what this leveling up is doing. I never noticed any difference from level to level. I actually don't know if your stats are going up when you level up. Where you can actually notice a difference is in the power up menu, where you can spend points to unlock abilities or upgrade them, as well as upgrading your basic attack and also your health. You gain more of these points and money by completing specific objectives, like do a certain amount of perfect dodges or pull off a certain number of attacks in a row without taking damage. And you do have an incentive to do this, as usually the amount of points you get through the game is quite low, but again, because of the issues with the gameplay, this can be a bit harder to pull off than intended. All in all, though, the combat of DC Superhero Girls is okay. It's better than the Avengers, I'm not lying, I swear. But it isn't going to be wowing anyone. It's not amazing either. But moving on, let's talk about some of the open world and side objectives of this game. There are three main areas. The school, that is very basic, not much to do here. It's literally just the front of the school. Some story bits happen here and some quests end here or start here, but it's really not a big level. Then we have the old city, which is the biggest map, and it's also the map that has the sewer system. This map is where most of the side missions will be, and also collectathon elements, so there's a high chance that this is the map you're going to spend the most time in. But then we have the third area, Hobbs Bay, which is probably the most odd, as you can build on it, so to say, and because of that feature, it kinda ends up being the most interesting map, but not for particularly good reasons. More on that later. First, I want to talk about the collectathon nature of the game. This is honestly a fairly well done piece of the game with really addictive quality, as the game has various teddy bears to collect and hero and villain symbols to photograph throughout the three main areas. This is fairly enjoyable at the beginning of the game, as not only rewards you with points and money among other things, but also lets you explore the world and incentivizes you to try and reach locations that are not so easily accessible. Like the most common example in this game, rooftops, which does contradict a bit with the fact that you're playing with characters that can fly and have superpowers, but more on that in a second. As the collectibles do kinda get old. It is just a crazy amount of collectibles and there's not a whole lot of variety and just not a whole lot of maps. Even the biggest map in this game, Old City, can be crossed in under a minute, and that's without any of the superpowers. This is what I was hinting at just a second ago. The thing is, when you're in the open world mode, you can't use your superpowers, which kinda makes sense in the sense that you're trying to hide your identity, but also doesn't make sense in the fact that this is a video game about playing as superheroes. The only exception for this is the VR mode that's unlocked later on, a mode that also allows you to replay older levels, but I wouldn't count that as using your superpowers in the open world because you can't use it for the collectathon and it's really just to play around. Honestly, in a way the collectathon aspect of this game kinda reminds me of PS2 games like Jak and Daxter, but in a very basic way, as your moveset in this mode is quite simple. In the open world, you have the just regular 3D movement, of course, with a simple jump and nothing else. It does really feel like a missed opportunity to not be able to use your powers in this open world mode, especially since you can already change between any of the characters while in this mode so easily. Now, speaking of that, in this open world, certain missions can only be done by certain characters, which I believed I already mentioned, but once again, these missions mostly relate to either that collectathon aspect or combat. But there's also another one very common type of mission, which I did end up enjoying quite a bit, which was the photography missions. These missions will have you photograph things, which is fairly fun and lighthearted, usually just having you look for something or someone specific in the map to photograph them or photograph with them, because of course you can also take selfies. Also, working with this feature is the fame that you get online. Another small feature in this game where your pictures will get posted online and you'll get likes and you'll get followers and comments on them. And while this is fine, even if a bit useless to be honest, it only really works into a couple of side missions. And overall, it does end up getting a bit annoying, as you'll be constantly getting notifications whenever someone leaves a comment or likes your pictures. And this annoyance does feel a bit undeserved, given that again it doesn't really play that important of a role into the actual gameplay. And the same can be said for one of the last pieces of the gameplay, which is the buildings. For story reasons, at certain points in the plot you'll be able to decide what buildings get built in the Hobbs Bay area, and you can spend a lot of money on this, as often buildings can be some of the most expensive things in this game, but they hardly have any practical use. Yeah, you can open up a store that sells superhero costumes, but one will open up anyways in the old city, so there's not really a point. And in my honest opinion, I think you should just save up your money for clothing bits, which are also pretty expensive and purely aesthetic, but still a nice thing to have, even though I wish there was more variety. Here, most characters only have 3 hero or villain costumes, and the regular costumes that you use in the open world, while there is a few more of them, they also don't really go over 4 pieces of clothing, with each type of clothing fitting a category like head accessories, tops, bottoms, and shoes that are also mixed in with socks. Honestly, I would say if you don't care about cosmetics, just exchange your money for points, which is a thing you can do. But also remember to save a little bit, because the buildings aspect is obligatory, but you can't just buy like the cheapest building possible as well. Anyways, to finish this off, honestly, gameplay wise, it feels like it's half baked in a lot of ways. There are good things about it, but it's just never enough. It's also just overall a short game. The campaign can be beaten under 7 hours if you don't bother with the side missions, which I do recommend doing because they do add a bit of variety, which this game desperately needs. I just wish there was more reasons to drop so much money on the buildings, or more variety in the missions. As it stands, it's just okay, and in my personal opinion, I would still say it's better than the Avengers game, even if purely because it doesn't have any bad mechanics for the sake of microtransactions and grinding, which is something I should not have to praise, but oh well, this is the life we live. Actually, one thing I almost forgot to mention that is really important, and the reason I almost forgot is because I turned it off very early on in the game, but it does pertain to the gameplay, and that is the camera. You can even see it in the gameplay as I turn it off, but the smart camera of this game is bad. It just loves pointing to the ground for no reason, and it's really annoying that way. It's like giving yourself a Joy-Con drift willingly. My advice is to just turn it off in the options and use the manual camera all the time. You'll thank me. Overall, the camera is pretty in general though, even with the smart feature turned off, as it is a bit slow, with the only saving grace here being the lock-on system, which is also just okay. Moving on to the graphics then, it's not a technically impressive game, I think you probably knew that, and the worlds themselves do leave a little to be desired, but in the sense that it's going for the aesthetic of a 2D cartoon and translating it to 3D, I think it did a good job, especially with the character designs, which I do enjoy quite a lot. Don't expect anything to blow your mind. If anything, it's actually a bit underwhelming in the performance sense, because it's already not nearly the nicest looking Switch game, but it also ends up having quite a few slowdowns when there's a lot of enemies on screen. That being said, it's never so bad that it's unplayable, but still something that's slightly annoying and worth pointing out. To summarize then, characters good, everything else Soundtrack wise, it's fine. Nothing sounded bad, but also nothing really stood out as great. My real problem here is really with the sound design, with the already mentioned Instagram like feature, with the photos, as you get constant notifications over your likes and comments. It is grating, but overall the sound of the game is okay, I guess. And that's this whole game, I guess. It's okay. There are some promising bits, but they're never fully developed, and so they end up feeling mediocre. That being said, I still enjoyed my time with it, and because of that, I'll be giving DC Superhero Girls Teen Power a 6 out of 10. It is a nice little game for kids. Yeah, it is very much for kids. And recommendations wise, I find it hard to recommend to people my age unless you like the graphical style and the cheerful nature of it. Or, and this one is somewhat interesting, maybe you're just looking for something that is reminiscent of those decent but not great video game adaptations on the PS2 and PS3 that all kind of follow this formula of action with some weird feature that was never fully thought through. An era of games which you just don't see nowadays, and maybe you have a nostalgia for it, as most adaptations of cartoons or animated movies just kinda end up as mobile games now. Or maybe you want to play this game because you're a fan of the show, which in that case I do think you would enjoy it, especially if you're within the main demographic for it. In fact, I would say if you're a parent and maybe your kid or kids want a superhero game and they're still young, then this is probably not a bad choice. But kids can be weird, so maybe introduce them to the show first if you decide to do that. Given if they ask for the Avengers game for their birthday and you give them this, they might not be grateful for it. Anyways though, enough rambling. I hope you enjoyed this video and I hope it helped you make a decision in whatever that decision may be. And regardless of that, I hope you enjoyed watching, and if so, please consider leaving a comment and subscribing and liking. All things you can do for free here on YouTube, and regardless of that, I hope you're having a good day, and goodbye.